So we're going to be talking about cancer, survivorship, and prevention, and the emphasis tonight is going to be on survivorship. And the opinion, and we think the facts support the idea that for the cancer patient, their lifestyle choices are as important as anything else they choose, with the possible exception of the surgeon. So we would argue that that changing your lifestyle has as great as impact on outcomes from cancer as radiation, chemotherapy. And as I say that during the talk, that should not be taken as suggesting that you shouldn't get radiation and chemotherapy and eat broccoli instead, but that they all are important. And furthermore, I'm hoping to show in the data that you're going to have fewer side effects from conventional therapy like radiation, chemotherapy, and you're going to heal faster from surgery, and you're going to bounce back faster if the cancer patient really employs lifestyle medicine aggressively. And it's really simple. And so when we're working with a cancer patient, we want to assist them in going through cancer therapy and be as vigorous throughout it as they can be with a high quality of life, and that means maximizing the efficacy of conventional therapy, minimizing side effects from conventional therapy, reducing risk of recurrence, reducing risk of death, of course, subsequent cancers, and then the other diseases. So does anybody want to take a hazarded guess at what you're most likely to die of if you're just a generic cancer patient? What are you most likely to die of, the cancer or something else? Something else. And that something else is most commonly it's heart disease. So we want to also have the patient be healthier in every respect, and get back to a normal life, not have too much weighing over them. So there's a bunch of ways that you can take control, and often patients say to us that they feel like they're out of control when they're in cancer therapy. And part of that is our medical profession does tend to sort of dehumanize people to some extent. It's easy to sort of become a number, and I think all of us have been guilty of letting that happen to our patients. But a lot of that can be fixed by you and your family, your loved ones. So first of all, you don't just take necessarily the first doctor that comes along to be your cancer doctor. You have somebody who you can communicate well with and who's technically proficient. It'd be better to have a bad personality and be effective than a really nice guy who's kind of useless. There are both in the medical profession. And sort of within that team that you develop, identify who is kind of the go-to person, the owner who owns your case the most. And it may be a nurse, maybe a nurse navigator, it may be a doctor, but somebody who's going to go to bat for you. It might be your primary care physician. Ideally, we'd see PCPs more involved in this role. There's a lot that happens in cancer patient visits. And we really think it's important to have somebody there with you as much as possible. Have somebody who's with a brain, a memory, who's taking notes, who can help clear out some of the confusion that happens too often. And we suggest our patients be at least a little bit annoying. If you're not asking enough questions to be annoying, you're probably not asking enough questions. Because like anybody else, physicians do better if they're accountable, do better if they're challenged, do better if they have to rise to a higher standard. And so asking questions and discussing things, and it's not that if common sense or the data shows that you should disagree with a physician, do that. And then it's their job, I would submit, to show that they're right and you're wrong. But don't be afraid to stand up for yourself through the whole process, because it's complicated. For most cancers, it's pretty complicated. And when you have this kind of attitude of taking control, you're going to have less confusion, I would submit. You're going to have greater clarity in making decisions. You're going to have more confidence, less anxiety. And one of the really interesting aspects is you're going to have fewer surprises, so your expectations are going to be more reasonable. So often patients, for example, they might get a side effect from chemotherapy or radiation they weren't expecting. Well, if you ask more questions, read more stuff, then it would be less disturbing because you'd know that that kind of thing happens. And often the medical profession just don't communicate as well as we'd like them to. And once again, I've been as guilty as anybody else in that regard. So ask lots of questions, do lots of reading, and have a friend that helps you. And when you have that attitude, your medical team is going to do a better job for you. They're going to rise to the occasion, I would submit, in most cases. If they don't, you should find a different medical team. And so what are the choices you've got that can have an impact on how things turn out? One is food. We're going to be talking about that. One is physical activity. One is waste management. That's central adiposity. We could talk about other tools. We sort of, the way we've got it set up, we were going to mainly talk about just those first three items, but that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of other aspects to cancer care, but those are the three big ones. And I'm going to be saying this probably potentially too much, but we really think that you should pay attention to the lifestyle choices, as simple as they are. And I think that you'll see that the data shows that they are equal to anything else you can do for your long-term outcomes. So if we'll just touch on prevention really briefly. People who've come to my lectures have probably seen this slide a dozen times because it's kind of a nice all-enveloping slide in terms of what we know about outcomes. It summarizes the literature well. So this Nurses' Health Study data, about 130,000 people followed for 20 to 30 years, depending on the cohort that we're talking about. And it showed that just this basic steps of activity, not smoking, not being too chubby, and eating a reasonably good diet dramatically reduce your risk of cancer, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, you name it. And so the prevention data is very clear, very well described in different populations and consistent. Incidentally, anytime you have a question, feel free to interrupt me. I don't mind being interrupted. In fact, maybe you can get me back on track if I've started to wander. So yell at any point, especially if you disagree with something I've said. Because if you disagree with something I've said, or if what I've said is confusing to you, it's probably confusing to somebody else too. So we might as well clear it up, or you can just show me that I'm wrong right away. And in this study, it's kind of interesting because on average, people lived who took better care of themselves lived about 12 years longer. And in the world of epidemiology, 12 years increased length of life is huge. That's not a minor achievement. So we want to improve the health of the patient. We want to reduce non-cancer risks, and especially cardiovascular disease. And when we talk about cardiovascular disease, we're really talking about type 2 diabetes as well, because they're so closely linked. And so when we look at the lifestyle choices, we also see quite a bit of evidence, you'll see, in terms of reduction in side effects from chemotherapy and radiation. Less fatigue, better exercise capacity, being able to do more. More strength, more physical function, less likely to be frail and fall. Improved quality of life, of course, less anxiety and depression. And the last item about better tolerance of therapy is really important because where our conventional therapies might be toxic but also effective, they're more effective if you can complete them. And so one of the advantages of pursuing an aggressive lifestyle approach is that radiation and chemotherapy are going to be better tolerated. You're more likely to be able to complete an effective course. And so seeing these things dovetailing of combining to help your outcomes is an important way to think about it. Because a lot of this stuff is, as those of you who've gone through it, a lot of it can be pretty miserable. And so, once again, dietary choices, physical activity, waste management, and we're going to talk a little bit about alcohol because it's such a big deal right now. People are talking about it a lot. I'm just mentioning nutritional supplements mainly as if you've got questions about them, we can talk about them. We use nutritional supplements very, very, very little. Not zero, but very, very little. And so if people want to have questions about that, we're glad to talk about that. So the diets that have been shown to be effective in cancer survivors, so these are people who have cancers, primarily are the whole food diets. And you've got the Mediterranean diet has the most data. DASH is sort of a low salt, low fat version of the Mediterranean diet. And then there's something called the Chinese food pagoda, which is kind of cute. So some researchers in Shanghai decided they'd take, why were the Greeks having all the fun? And so they took a traditional whole food Chinese diet and looked at the same kind of data. We aren't going to be talking much about vegetarian or vegan diets, and feel free to ask about that if you want. And that's simply because of the lack of data. And the data that is available is not very encouraging. So we can talk about that to the extent that people want to. And then every now and then people want to know about the high protein, high fat diets like paleo and keto. And we don't think those have a place either. Once again, lack of data, lack of historical precedent, and so on. But once again, anytime you want to ask about any of these things, feel free to yell. So the Mediterranean data, the Mediterranean diet is omnivorous, meaning it includes all traditional foods. It includes essentially all traditional foods, including dairy, fish, and meat. It emphasizes vegetables, fruit, beans, legumes, nuts, seeds. Olive oil is primary kitchen fat, and we'll spend a little time on that. And it pretty much always includes moderate alcohol. And in fact, when you look at I'll touch on that later on. It's the original plant-based diet. People use this term plant-based diets. And they usually are meaning a vegan diet. When in actual fact, we'd say the Mediterranean diet is the original plant-based diet. It's mostly fruits, vegetables, beans, and grains, to which you add some animal products. And once again, it is the diet that has the greatest evidence across the greatest span of years, the greatest span of studies, and the greatest span of diseases. So poke any disease at the Mediterranean style diet and we can show you benefit. Anything from dementia to type 2 diabetes to heart disease to stroke to joint disease and so on. Looking at Mediterranean diet in randomized controlled trials that weren't intended to look at cancer, right? These are sort of accidental findings, so you always got to watch out for accidental findings. But it's in terms of prevention, it's actually useful to know about these models. The first one was PREDIMED. It was what's called a primary prevention study for heart disease. And they looked at a group of people that were considered to be at high risk of heart disease but hadn't actually had any heart events or strokes. Put on a Mediterranean-style diet, supplemented with olive oil or nuts, compared to a low-fat diet of the American Heart Association-style low-fat diet, and found that they had substantially reduction in stroke especially. But in the olive oil and Mediterranean diet group, they had a 68% reduction in breast cancer, which is the main cancer that they had enough data to actually give a comment on. And this has been shown as an incidental finding in many of the early Mediterranean diet studies. One of them is probably the granddaddy of them is the Lyon Heart Study, which went for 4 years, a study on people who had had a heart attack to see if changing their diet, it was only a diet study, so no exercise, they didn't get people to lose weight, they didn't get people to stop smoking. So just a diet alone study. And after 4 years, there's about a 70% reduction in heart disease, which exceeds anything that we've ever done with pharmaceutical medicine. About a 50 or 55% drop in death rates, and about a 60% reduction in cancers. At the time when the study was published, it was sort of thought it was probably just an accident. If you do enough studies, eventually you'll find some weird result, which if you're trying to sell something is really great. But in actual fact, the reduction in cancers showed up in study after study after study, which led to the next group of studies, which we'll talk about. And I've already, I think, touched on the restrictive diets. So restrictive diets we consider to be things like paleo, keto, vegetarian, vegan, anything where a lot of traditional foods are excluded. Any questions to this point? It's a really well-behaved group.
I just have one. I was recommended at one point to go on a like an anti-inflammation diet, and so low carb, so it sort of skirted paleo and keto. Do you have anything to say about low inflammation, or is that what the Mediterranean diet is? Nicely
put. So her question is, she was advised to go on an anti-inflammatory diet or a low inflammatory factor diet for cancer. And so what's interesting is that many people who are told to go on an anti-inflammatory diet are told to avoid coffee and dairy and grains and this and that. And if you actually look at most of those recommendations, they're mostly, and I'm not using the term lightly, garbage. I don't know where they come up with this stuff. And when I'm at conferences and stuff, I ask people, hey, where do you get these ideas? And I don't get too many replies, unfortunately. They probably get mad at me. I don't know why. So the diets that have been most strongly associated with lower inflammatory loads. So there's ways of measuring inflammation in the body. There's a bunch of different ways. So first of all, if you're going to measure this, you want to measure a basket of inflammatory markers. And the diet that has been associated most strongly with lower inflammatory loads is, you only get one answer? Yay! You get bonus points if you say any weight loss diet. So we're pretty sure if I put you on 800 calories of Twinkies a day and you lost weight, your inflammatory loads would go down. It's actually been studied, I kid you not. I'm not making this up. This professor was wanting to prove that if you reduce your calories, you're going to lose weight. And so weight loss, or waist loss, I should say, anything where you reduce your waist, you're almost certainly your inflammatory markers are going to go down. If you increase your muscle mass, increase your fitness, your inflammatory markers are usually going to be able to go down until you become an overexerciser. So endurance athletes, for example, they actually have higher inflammatory markers. So it looks like, as with everything else in life, there's what we could call a hormesis curve, or a hockey stick curve, or a J-shaped curve, where a little bit's bad, a bit more is good, and too much is too much. And that seems to apply to everything in life, including oxygen and water.
Miles, is there a correlation between heart disease and Eliquis? Could Eliquis be cut in half or removed if one is on a really good
Off
Mediterranean
topic,
diet?
Dr. Jacobs.
Hot topic?
Off topic.
Off topic.
We're not talking about blood thinners and heart disease tonight. Sorry, but we could talk about that privately.
I tried.
Yeah, right. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so when we're talking about a whole food Mediterranean diet model, just to fill things in, we're talking about whole intact grains, vegetables and fruit, fish, meat, and poultry, cultured dairy, nuts, seeds, and legumes, and extra virgin olive oil. And we're just going to go through a couple of different studies, and these the studies I referred to earlier were prevention studies. If we give people this stuff, do they get less of whatever? So these are some studies just looking at breast cancer outcomes. And one of the reasons we talk about breast cancer and colon cancer so much, and we're going to be mostly talking about breast cancer, is those are the cancers for which we have data. And so what we're asking people to do is realize that there's only a few cancers for which we actually have good data, and then we have total cancer data. And those two groups of data actually overlap really well. So we think that by talking about breast cancer data or colon cancer, I could show you the same data for colon cancer, I'll be showing you one study on that, that we can, that it's not unreasonable in our current state of knowledge to say that these are probably approaches that have a wide application throughout the world of cancer. And because they apply to so many other disease processes, we're pretty sure we're right on that. But it is a speculation, but reasonable speculation. So in the Shanghai study, this is the group that put together the Chinese pagoda food model. So they had 3,500 patients, followed them for 5 years, and looked at all the different outcomes that we'd normally look at, and found that those who followed the whole food recommendations most closely had the lowest rate of total mortality, recurrence rates, and breast cancer-related outcomes, harmful outcomes. And so the foods that they found most important were the fish, poultry, beans, grains, nuts, and legumes, eggs, vegetables, and dairy. The problem with any of these food frequency things that you should keep in the back of your mind, if anybody ever concentrates on any one of these, I don't know if my little marker shows up, is that in these studies, when we try to say which food made the difference, I think it's fair to say we've never been able to do that. There's something synergistic about whole food that doesn't allow us to say this is what works. with the possible exception perhaps of extra virgin olive oil, which we'll be talking about in a minute. How much benefit? We're talking 25 to 34%, depending on different aspects of the cohorts, lower risk of dying of any cause, which is the most important statistic. Anybody who's saying, hey, we think you should have this treatment for this cancer, or any disease process at all, try to find out how much it will reduce your risk of dying of any cause, because that's the most important statistic. And you may or may not want to put up with certain side effects if it's not likely to increase your length of life or in a significant way. The results were even better if you just looked at breast cancer specific outcomes and if you looked at cancer recurrence rates. So those are in cancer, those are kind of the three statistics you want to know about in terms of treatment I would submit. You also want to know about side effects and things like that. But total mortality, will this prevent my cancer coming back or a second cancer? And will it reduce a cancer-specific outcome that might be important? The pathway study was a Western study, and also about 3,500 women diagnosed with invasive breast cancer. This actually, the word invasive is important in these studies too, because when you're looking at any given cancer, so in the case of breast cancer, for example, there's an entity called DCIS, which is, there's even debate as to whether it's cancer or not. And so if you have a study that includes a lot of that group that are non-invasive breast cancers, that's going to skew your results in a way that may not be relevant to you. And so looking for aspects like that and getting used to reading these studies or reading the abstracts, talking to people about it, it's not actually too hard to know a lot about these studies. There's a vocabulary to learn, maybe a couple hundred words. There's a few concepts to learn, but it's not that hard. Don't let the medical profession flummox you with fancy words that are actually really easy to learn. Not that we would ever do that. So I looked at diet at the time of diagnosis, and a lot of these issues are each important because a reasonable person can say, hey, what if they change their diet after diagnosis and that kind of stuff? And these are all appropriate questions to ask, but we often don't have the answer for them. So people who had a whole food eating pattern, which we assume was followed after the diagnosis, also had, in this case, a 21 to 27% lower risk of total mortality. And the foods that they correlated in this study, the strongest was whole fruits and vegetables, whole grains, beans and legumes, fish and nuts. And these are statistical relationships that may or may not be important, but the more you see the pattern developing, the more important it probably is. And neither of these studies, of course, that we talked about, or this one either, the EPIC study, none of them included an exercise arm. These are just diet-only interventions. So when you're reading studies or you're seeing headlines, try to nail down, what does this really say? Like, if you see a study in a headline that says, such and such, eating pomegranates improves cancer outcomes. Well, find out what improves mean. Don't take any of these loose words which salespeople like to use without knowing what they really mean. Improves might be important, but maybe it meant people lived one day longer. And believe it or not, I'm not exaggerating very much, that many of our sales pitches involve improvements that a sensible person would laugh at and say, that's pretty trivial. Why are we talking about this? And the reason we talk about it is it might be worth $30,000. So this is the EPIC study. So the EPIC is a big European, the EPIC has lots and lots of arms. 13,000 women followed for 8 years. And those who had the lower, they used what's called food frequency questionnaire for this one, or Mediterranean diet score. And the Mediterranean diet scores are pretty well validated. What they do is they basically give people 16 or 18 different criteria to say what they adhere to. And it allows you to kind of semi-quantify, in a very, very difficult area to quantify, which is food, what people are actually doing. And so those who had the lower adherence to the Mediterranean diet had significantly higher risk of dying. And to the extent that for every 3 points on the scale, you could see an 8% difference in overall mortality in this study. So we could talk about many other studies as well, but I just wanted to give you this pattern where we're seeing a substantial reduction in overall mortality in people who eat well who have cancer. So this is not prevention data. This is people who actually have cancer. This applied, in this study, they also did subgroup analysis looking at people who were postmenopausal or premenopausal, and the results were sustained among both. And it was even stronger in people with metastatic cancer. And that's been shown over the last 20 or 25 years, that the benefit appears to be at least as strong or stronger in people, even if they have metastatic cancer. And so the point that we're making is that we're seeing this consistent 20 to 40% maybe reduction in total mortality over 5 to 8 years in women with breast cancer. And we actually have data implying this in terms of Mediterranean diet and overall health in hundreds of studies. So it's a pretty consistent data. This was an interesting paper. As far as I know, it hasn't been repeated, but this is in people with colon cancer. Ravasco did this in Portugal, and she took people who had colon cancer and randomized into one of 3 groups. They were either 6 weeks of education about regular foods, in other words, eat good food. The second group were eat whatever you usually eat, but we'll give you a high protein supplement as well, what we'd call ultra processed food, the kind of stuff we give you in the hospital, like Ensure and Boost, or their usual diet. And so the people in the first group, the nutritional education group in this study, had significantly lower total mortality, less treatment-associated toxicity, and better long-term quality of life. And this was a colon cancer group, so I put it in because it added to some variety. But group 1 is the group that just got whole food advice. And you can see in terms of the disease-specific survival, they did the best. This is called the Kaplan-Meier curve. If you ever feel like an interesting piece of statistical knowledge that would serve you well if you're a patient, is to learn how to read Kaplan-Meier curves, and there's some really good YouTubes that talk about this, because these can easily be manipulated. But clearly the group 1 nutritional therapy had much better disease-free survival. You can see this group, their survival was half that of this group. And radiotherapy, so in this case they were measuring toxicity from radiation, and you see the people that had the nutritional therapy had less radiation-associated side effects. And that's super important, because if you can sustain, so the radiation helps, but radiation also hurts. If you can reduce the hurt and get the help, you're going to be a whole lot better off. And so many people just can't tolerate radiation and have to stop early, which it has an adverse effect. So once again, I'd like to emphasize that when you're using lifestyle, you're actually going to make your conventional therapy work better. Let's talk a little bit about extra virgin olive oil. So olive oil has a long history of being associated with less cancer incidence, less dementia. It's interesting effects on better gut health. This whole thing of the microbiome, the bugs that live in your gut and the different things that influence it, which can be anything from probiotic foods like sauerkraut and yogurt and kefir and kimchi and kombucha, those kinds of things, to vinegar, to wine, olive oil, exercise. These all affect the gut. And the late 1800s German naturopaths, they talked about how everything begins and ends in the gut. And the more we learn about this stuff, it looks like those guys were right. I don't know how they came up with what they came up with, but if you can get your gut to work right, the rest of you is going to work a whole lot better. So we see this huge range of benefits for olive oil, which really don't have any really mechanistic meaning. In other words, we can't say, oh, olive oil does this because of this. We can sort of guess. We can talk about phenolics and so on. But it's interesting because we just don't have any food with this kind of strength of data. And so it's less heart disease, less dementia. We talked about all that stuff. And I'd like to point out this sentence, and because this often creates some conversation. I'm not aware of any other vegetable oil that even comes close. So I don't know if you got some avocado oil or grapeseed oil or canola oil fans out here, but I would say, why should we talk about your oils? Anybody want to make a case for canola? Oh.
I don't want to make a case, but what would I tell someone who is trying to tell me the benefits of avocado oil and how? I don't know if that necessarily.
Yeah, so the first question I ask them is, hey, how do they make avocado oil?
Miles, do you want to repeat the question?
Oh, so the question is, what do you tell somebody who tells you that avocado oil is great because it's got a high smoke point? Does that sound familiar to anybody here? I see lots of nods. So the first question, and I can see I don't have anybody who's willing to defend avocado oil here. Wimps. So the first question I ask them is, how do they make it? Because in order to make avocado oil or canola oil or safflower oil or peanut oil in the way that you're used to having it, which is clear, relatively tasteless, pleasant, it has to go through a lot of processing. And that processing generally is a couple of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, anything up to about 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you ever see the word cold processed on a vegetable oil that looks nice and clean and has very little flavor, say, oh, after it was pressed, how hot did it get? And if you can find somebody who can answer that question, let me know. If you phone up the companies that make it, you're going to be on the phone for a long time. If you write them a letter, they'll probably not get a reply. It's actually remarkably hard to get details about the processing of these oils. So the first question is, can they tell you how it's made? So I can tell you how olive oil is made. You take olives, you squash them. The stuff that comes out is called extra virgin olive oil. And if it's over, as I understand it, it can't be done if it's over about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a true cold pressed. And then you're done. It's the same way that they were making olive oil when Jesus was here.
There's a Red Ridge farm out in here, McMinnville.
Yay!
It's a great place to go to see how olive oil is.
Yeah, in fact,
Give you a tour.
are they squeezing now?
Yeah, it's right now.
Yeah, so the Red Ridge Farms, the name of the family is Durant, yeah.
Durant.
They seem to be using their family name more than Red Ridge these days. But yeah, so if you go down to Durant, it's a really good experience any time of year. But when they're squeezing the olives, it's even better.
You can schedule a time and go for a whole tour. It's really fun.
Yeah.
And then taste these award-winning olive oils for free.
And it's and they're sort of specialists in this area. But it's called I think temperate climate olives or cold climate olives or something like that. Because this is about as far north as anybody's ever been able to make commercial olives.
You hit on gut health. I know the microbiome is super hot right now, and I am really interested in getting my microbiome tested. And I was just curious, if you have any advice about a service, because I'm also really afraid to give my data. I'm paranoid that I can't trust whoever I send it to. So do you have any advice about that?
Yes, let me finish my avocado oil question because I was on a roll here.
Okay,
I just got
sorry.
distracted,
And
and then I'll get back to the
Okay.
So the first question is, how do you make it? And they never know. The second question is, okay, what's the best sales pitch you've got for your avocado oil? And they might say smoke point. And I say, well, tell me how smoke point relates to health outcomes. And you get the same blank stare you got when you asked them how it's made. Thirdly, you can then say, is avocado oil associated with any improvement in health? Fair question. Third blank stare. So at that point, the person you're asking the questions of, because you're asking very legitimate questions, should be saying to themselves, why in the world am I recommending avocado oil when I know nothing about the subject? At which point, you need to go find a different friend. But
But the trouble is, all the experts are telling this person. And they figure, well, these people have done all the research. They're the experts. So just because I don't know the effect of high smoke points on health, or just because I don't know about the studies, doesn't mean it isn't true.
True. So then you then say, go ask the experts. And they won't answer these questions either. And if they do, let me know. But I've not been able to get people to ask. Because nothing else has this kind of data. And I'll be showing you some more data in a second. And so the basic issue is everybody else is arguing from a position of silence and usually ignorance. Olive oil can show you the receipts for improved health outcomes and historical precedent. So the lady who just spoke was my sister Mia, and Mia and I wrote a book. Just a little sales pitch. Anybody who buys the book, it supports greatmed.org, incidentally. So we talked about this quite a bit and how to look at these arguments in the books, or how to think your way through sales pitches. And we ask for any recommendation that's made, we argue should have at least 3 lines of independent evidence to support it. And so one of those lines, we would argue, usually should be historical precedent. If people haven't been doing something for a long time, watch out. We don't know much about it, it may not work. And so avocado oil, how long have people been eating avocado oil? Not too long. The reason is it's really hard to make until you had modern industrial processing. And that, what I just said, applies pretty much to all of the vegetable oils except for extra virgin olive oil. And the reason is most of them don't taste very good. So unprocessed safflower, unprocessed canola, these are all, they taste awful. Canola oil tastes like turnips until you run it through your 500 degree Fahrenheit processing. And so the problem is you can't just squeeze these oils. Even things like peanut oil, they're pretty strong in their unprocessed form. There's some exceptions. Olive oil is obviously an exception. Sesame oil, coconut, but neither sesame nor coconut have a strong evidence in the medical literature, but they might be just as good. At least they have historical precedent going for them. How did I do on the avocado oil argument? Hold on, Greg. I'm just going to talk to this lady asked about the microbiome. So the question about the microbiome is, where can she go get tested to find out if her microbiome is good? Is that a fair summary? And I would argue nobody knows what a good microbiome looks like. So I wouldn't get it tested. If you want a good microbiome, eat all those foods that give you a good microbiome, which is naturally fermented foods, whole foods with fiber, minimize sugars, that has its own adverse effect on the microbiome, and then oddball foods like wine, we'll be talking about in a second, apple cider vinegar, exercise. With all of this stuff, if you're claiming to look after your health and you're not getting exercise at least once a day, and preferably more than once a day, you're not even trying, in my humble opinion. So I wouldn't get it tested. Greg.
I think you said with avocado oil, you still have to heat it like several hundred degrees. And when you do that, that kills any good nutrition in it?
Nobody really knows, but it's pretty dumb to write cold pressed on the label on a product that you know, as the manufacturer of it, you know isn't cold when it's processed. So I just consider that a sign of dishonesty. But it doesn't have evidence for health benefits. And we actually have studies where they've heated olive oil and cooked things in them with great outcomes. This has been studied. Plus, one of the arguments we like to use is the Greek grandmother argument. So if you said to a Greek grandmother, hey, is it okay to cook with olive oil? What would she say? Yeah. You know, her great grandmother did it, and her great grandmother did it, and yeah, Eve probably did it. All right. So here's a group of studies. So these are all the studies that have looked at total mortality and olive oil consumption, comparing highest versus lowest. And typically, about 7 grams a day, which I think is about a teaspoon, is the sort of the dose for which there's been shown to be benefit. And this is called a forest plot. And anything on this side of the forest plot, on this side, means that you're less likely to die if you use olive oil. Anything on this side says you're more likely to die with olive oil. And so this is actually kind of a handy example of knowing how sketchy nutritional data is. So what you do is you look at the pattern. So for example, if that's the only study you had, you'd say olive oil kills. And so it's useful to know that if you cherry pick data, you get whatever result you want, and nowhere is that stronger than in lifestyle medicine. But so you look for trends and overall results, and you see this overall result is this pattern shows that the overall result is statistically significant, which is useful, and that overall it showed a reduction in death rate. If the only factor measured, if the only differences between these people was olive oil, you could show a reduction in total death rate. There aren't too many things we can show that for. And this is for cancer. So once again, you'd say, those two, olive oil will kill you. But by far, the greatest extent of data shows reduction in cancers, and that the overall result is statistically significant. So we're arguing that olive oil has data that nothing else can compare with. And in these studies, it's really it's harder to peel out extra virgin olive oil from olive oil, but where they have extra virgin olive oil always looks better. And mechanistically, because of the compounds in extra virgin olive oil, we're pretty sure that's where to bet your life.
So, how do they make olive oil that's not extra virgin olive oil?
Oh, so first of all, so you go down to Durant and you watch them squeezing the olives, and the poor little olives, they cry and stuff. And then the olive oil comes out and you eat that. Then you can take that cake of olive mass and you can process it in different ways and make the next stages of olive oil, until the final stage where you actually put what's basically gasoline in there and dissolve out all the rest of the olive oil, and then you boil off the gasoline. It's not really gasoline, but same idea, hexane, and then you get various grades of olive oil. And that's why we're not all that impressed when somebody says, "Oh, I've got this food packed in extra virgin olive oil," because we don't really believe them, because extra virgin olive oil is a lot more expensive.
By the way, when you whisper, we can't hear you in back.
Okay, well that's because it was secret. Okay, so if you're going to design your anti-cancer diet, we would argue you want to take these steps. Include vegetables or whole fruit with every meal and snack. And I tell you what, if you've got a waistline problem, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, if you eat vegetables or whole fruit before you eat anything else at every meal and snack, you are going to lose weight. If you're not losing weight, instead of eating one apple, eat 2 apples. But nobody ever gained weight on fruit or vegetables yet. Carrots, pears. Are you going to tell me you gained weight on apples?
No. Does it matter if those vegetables are cooked or not?
We don't think so. But whenever I say we don't think so, it means that I'm making it up, because nobody's ever studied that as far as I know. But we're pretty sure nobody's ever gained weight on cooked spinach either. So to some extent we rely on best guess and common sense and observation. Do you buy that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Whole grains or beans and legumes daily. Portland has quite a strong anti-grain community, which we think is just dopey, because we would argue that there is no food, and we go into this in some detail in our book, that of all the foods on the planet, except for the possible exception of olive oil, whole grains have the greatest evidence for benefit across all disease processes. And so if you ever want to come by our office, and we'll give you a free sample of one example of whole grain that you can use as a pilaf or breakfast cereal. It's 1/3 rye, 1/3 barley, and 1/3 oats. There are secrets out, Mia. And you can go down to Winco or Whole Foods or anywhere and put it together yourself. Or some combination thereof. Some people would use brown rice instead. And so, but whole grains don't underrate the importance of true whole grains for good health.
One quick question on the legumes. People say leaky gut, so don't eat beans or legumes. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so the question is, do beans or legumes cause leaky gut?
Yeah.
So leaky gut is a real thing. For those of us who have worked in an intensive care unit, where you get translocation of bacteria across the wall of the intestines, and then you get septic and die, then leaky gut's real. If you can find anybody who can explain how beans and legumes cause a leaky gut, let me know, because I need to hear about this. Because I've been looking at this for 25 years and I still haven't found any suggestion for it. And to me, it's a little bit like saying that dairy foods cause inflammation. when we have like 50 or 60, I'm not making this up, 50 or 60 studies looking at the subject that says that dairy actually reduces inflammation. And I was speaking at a major conference. So there were about 200 doctors sitting in front of me, putting up with me, most of whom believe that dairy caused inflammation. I won't tell you where it was because it's kind of embarrassing. It's to them, not me. But I wasn't invited back. And so I present this data on dairy and inflammation, and I stopped and I said, no, I know that many, many, many of you, 200 people with doctoral degrees, disagree with what I just presented, and this would be a good time to have a dialogue. You could have heard a pin drop. And it's not that they didn't disagree with me. It's that I think it's a faith thing. I think it's a religion. So if anybody of you can tell me how these things, how beans or legumes cause leaky gut, let me know. And I'd like to know how you prove it too. So we think beans and legumes are really good for you. And we argue that the evidence supports that. Good fat, so olive oil, raw nuts and seeds. Raw nuts and seeds they keep showing up in the literature for reducing deaths, and people don't talk about them much. Maybe somebody here who's like a marketing guy could get rich with a promotion for sunflower seeds or something. Avocados are good. But using these as a snack food, along with some fruit or vegetables, is really a good idea, especially if it keeps you from reaching into the Juanita's corn chips.
If you can cook with olive oil, is it as healthy as putting it on your salad?
No, it depends on what you mean by really, is it as healthy? So for example, the question is, if you cook with olive oil, is it just as healthy? And food is so synergistic. There's so many interplays between food that realistically you really can't answer, and nobody who's honest can really answer that question. But I can say that the research implies, so first of all, the research that we would call historical precedent, the fact that healthy people throughout the world have been cooking with olive oil for the entire recorded history of mankind. Not a bad first argument. Secondly, when you look at some of the mechanistic studies, for example, there's a compound in tomatoes called lycopene. And lycopene is sort of the substance that's been suggested is associated with less prostate cancer, is protective against prostate cancer. And there's quite a bit of data supporting that idea. But if you give people lycopene supplements, it doesn't really work. But if you give people cooked tomatoes and olive oil, then the olive oil increases the absorption of lycopene. So it's very likely that what we're seeing with olive oil is a synergistic effect with some other compound that the body needs.
But raw nuts or seeds, so that's why I was wondering.
Oh, well, we don't mind if you roast your nuts or seeds. But when you buy roasted nuts and seeds from a store, so they're roasted somewhere, and then they're put into a container, and then they're sitting on a shelf for weeks, months, years, like in the service station, and then you eat them. That's a whole different animal. That you take these high-fat foods, you heat them, you get all these peroxides, all these chemical reactions started because of the heat, and then if you do it at home and eat them then the next day or two, you might be fine. To buy commercially roasted things are not a good idea. And besides, they taste too good and you eat too much and get fat.
This is last call for recipe contest. I'm going to meet Julie over in the corner. And then our judges, Lori, Tor, if you could head over to that corner, that'd be super. And Anna, thank you. And then after your questions, we're going to announce the winner. And there is olive oil included in the prize. All right.
Durant olive oil from Red Ridge Farms. Should I move on to the next points, or Dr. Jacob?
Nuts, peanuts. What about peanuts?
Tell me the background to why you're asking about peanuts in particular. There's probably a reason.
A neighbor said that they're not good for us.
So peanuts have sort of gotten a bit of a... So peanuts are ground nuts. So most of the nuts you talk about are tree nuts. Peanuts are ground nut. And they... historically, they've sometimes had this fungus in them called aflatoxins, and aflatoxins have a really nasty toxin in them that kills you. But in reality, societies that eat a lot of nuts, especially in Africa, seem to do just fine. Peanuts, I mean. So we no longer condemn peanuts like we used to. But most people who eat peanuts eat roasted salted peanuts that they didn't roast and salt themselves. And so a case can be made against getting any nuts that somebody else roasted salted. But if you're getting your own nuts and you're roasting them yourself, we think they're probably fine. And we aren't too worried about aflatoxins.
I've always heard with nuts that they should be either sprouted or roasted to remove the sort of inhibitory, I can't think of the name of it, the inhibitory chemicals that are part of the seed.
Yeah, so the question is, should you roast or sprout nuts to get rid of any inhibitory compounds that are in there? And we don't think so. So once again, there's no historical precedent for that. No epidemiologic data that would support that idea. So we think that's kind of just sort of and I apologize again if I'm being offensive again, but some of these things sort of become cultish. And we just can't figure out what they're based on. And if people could give us a reasonable rationale why you're asking people to go to more work, that'd make a ton of sense. But if we're asking people, I'm asking them to do a lot of work just making all their own food at home and exercising and not eating too much. For many of us, that's quite a bit of work. And so I really don't think we should be adding another burden to people unless you have got a really good argument. And there's a guy in Palm Springs, this guy called Gundry. And he just comes up with all these things, and they're all kind of just made up. And it's kind of hilarious on one level, except on another level, people are turning their lives around to try to meet his specifications, which, as I said, are made up. So you may quote me. We'd love to have a debate with him. He doesn't invite that kind of thing. Probiotics, it's sort of like raw nuts and seeds. People sort of know they're supposed to have a healthy microbiome, but they don't really put a lot of effort into it. And so we think this is really worth putting a lot of effort. So it's kind of interesting because liquid milk, normal milk as you'd get out of your fridge, is a pretty highly processed food. It doesn't have historical precedent because until there's widespread refrigeration, people didn't really drink milk that much. They primarily used storage forms of dairy, which would be yogurt, kefir, and cheese. And so it's interesting that when you look at dairy data, it's actually it's easy to notice that the milk data is actually not consistently positive, but the cultured dairy data is. So yogurt, kefir, and cheese.
You seem to like sharp cheese over regular cheese. Why is that?
A case can be made for the more aged cheeses. So the question is there a difference between sharp cheeses and more fresh cheeses, softer cheeses? And the aged cheeses, one of the things about them is people don't eat them in as much quantity. They've got a lot more flavor. So with a high proportion of our patients, we're actually trying to help them lose weight as well. And you're more likely to lose weight on sharp cheddar than mozzarella. Secondly, the aged cheeses have more of certain compounds like vitamin K in them. And so we think that that's beneficial. But it's a soft recommendation. Any other questions about dairy? Fresh sauerkraut. It's pretty expensive out in the world. It's really cheap if you make it yourself. Mia's got a recipe for it. It's really easy to make. So we strongly recommend fresh sauerkraut. And then we don't have any problem with moderate amounts of animal protein, such as fish and chicken and red meat. Overall, in terms of health outcomes, if you look at any of the epidemiologic studies, and I don't think I'm wrong in saying any, so I'm saying every major epidemiologic study that I'm aware of, and correct me if you know one that I'm wrong about, where they've looked at what is the healthiest cohort in this group and what do they eat, every one of those studies, whether it's a nurse's health study, health professionals follow-up study, any of the EPIC studies, PURE, InterHeart, any of these big epidemiologic studies, the healthiest group always have some red meat. And in the Mediterranean diets overall, it looks like they average around 3 ounces per day of red meat on average. And so that's not a ton, but it's not none. And so we think that moderate red meat is a good idea. Some of the studies suggest somewhere around 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of raw weight is a good amount of red meat based on the epidemiology we have. It's a really fascinating area because once again, like so many of these, there's very strong opinions and more opinions than there are facts. So we think red meat's actually a good part of the diet, not just a tolerable part of the diet. Any questions about that part? Oh, I think pork is, sorry, I think I throw it in with red meats, but yeah.
So,
So many of these issues, just to mention very quickly, it looks like they're kind of being very casual and kind of brushing past them, but they're dealt with in detail in the book with studies. So, even if people don't understand why something is the case from your description, and can you move on to something else? It's all in the book in the first 100 pages, detail why you're saying what you're saying.
Well, they were hoping to get out of here sometime tonight, so they didn't want to.
I mention that because it's all dealt with in the book, and if you tend to be too brief, maybe with certain issues.
yeah, so if you're trying to increase your lean body mass muscle, especially as you age, right, you're supposed to be working with weights, well, then usually the recommendation is increase protein. But protein powder is not a good idea. So
Why do you say protein powder is not a good idea?
well, I thought you didn't like it because it's
I don't like it. No, I just was wondering what your no, I was just wondering what your rationale was. Yeah. So
at that point, then is it like these guidelines can be a little bit skewed just to make sure you get enough protein?
oh yeah. If you're eating overall an omnivorous diet, whole food diet, it's actually hard to show how much protein you should be eating, but at least a gram per kilo body weight is probably a minimum. So I don't think I included eggs there either. I should have thrown in eggs there too. Yeah, but he brings up protein powders. I don't think I was bringing up protein powders in this talk, but as long as you raise it. Protein powders are a little bit like vegetable oils. The people that sell them can't tell you how they make them. And so we think that they shouldn't be called protein powders. We think they should be called chemical constructs. And if you find out how they're made, you could see why I say that. So if you buy a pea protein powder, for example, it's not just peas that have been ground up and the fiber removed or something. It's a chemical construct that started with peas. And so it's a little bit like saying, hey, I'm eating white sugar and that's just like eating sugar cane. Well, no, it's not. And so we would argue against protein powders with the possible exception of brewer's yeast and nutritional yeast. So these are two traditional foods that run about 50% protein. And so they're actually a very useful protein supplement if you use them. They're loaded with other good nutrition. They're also loaded with a flavor that not everybody gets real excited about. So if you try brewer's yeast or nutritional yeast, they're great foods, but start with a small amount. Otherwise, you'll never speak to me again.
It's an acquired taste.
An acquired taste, absolutely. So start with like a half a teaspoon. Anything else that we're thinking about in terms of what you're including in your diet? Any thoughts there? So, well, actually, let me see if I can get any more argument here. Any foods that are here that you think that you have a basis for saying you should not include?
Yeah, kimchi, because I can't stand it.
So we have one argument against kimchi, but it's based on personal attitude.
Butter.
Butter. We think butter is great. It should be, everything's better with butter, as Julia Child said. But it shouldn't be your main kitchen fat. But if you want the butter flavor, let's say you really like the flavor of butter fried in egg, your eggs fried in butter, but want a little more olive oil in your diet, well, put half olive oil, half butter in the pan, and you get the butter flavor and the olive oil benefit as well. So these things can be combined. So foods to avoid. I didn't present the data, but as Mia points out, it is in the book. The data for highly processed foods, and the term used in the research is usually ultra-processed. It's very, very consistently bad. Bad for total mortality, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, even depression. And so really watch out for foods made outside the home. The trouble with the data, it also, everything from gummy bears to canned garbanzo beans technically could be included in the ultra-processed lineup. We're pretty sure that that canned garbanzo beans are much better for you than gummy bears. And so you also want to take into account sort of historical precedent. If people have been eating canned garbanzo beans for a long time, then you're probably fine. But just watch out for food made outside the home and get in the habit of eating simple foods that you make yourself. You'll also save a ton of money. Any questions about ultra-processed foods? I think it's a pretty important topic.
With the way families are now, how do you help families not bring ultra-processed food home? It's, to cook all inside the home takes hours. I can do it now that I'm retired, but I remember those meals I used to throw together when we were just hungry.
Well, the way Mia has organized the recipes in our book, it's really intended to try to make it easy for people, to make them simple. A lot of leftovers. We often look at families where the kids really aren't involved in food preparation. We think that's really dumb. Use as much labor as you've got hanging around. And sort of prioritize. I sometimes ask people if they have a weapon in their home, and they look at me very suspiciously. And sometimes they'll admit to having a weapon in their home. So I say, put a bullet through your TV, and suddenly you're going to have a lot more time on your hands. And things like that. In which case, they can go find a less inflammatory doctor. What was that?
Do they laugh when you say, what do they say when you
They usually look sort of horrified. But the idea being, what are you spending your time on? Are you spending time on, and what do you want life to look like? Because if you're in my office, there's probably something not right. In other words, there's probably something wrong with you. And so, do you want to fix it or don't you? And if you're in my office, you might be somebody who's interested in doing it with minimal drugs. And that takes a bunch of work. If you want an easy answer, don't come to me. So what I'm saying is that you're absolutely right. It does take a lot of time. And I bet you in this room we've got a whole bunch of, this maybe sounds chauvinistic, but a whole bunch of women who've had to make that choice in terms of feeding their family well, and they've done it. But it does mean you're not going to spend time on something else. On the other hand, the good side is you're going to save a whole lot of time. And also, husbands need to be put to more work too.
I have a question about, for example, corn tortillas that are just masa and water. Are those still considered bread, or are they considered whole grain?
They're whole grain, but they're made with flour. The question is, are things like corn tortillas whole grain, or are they? So they may be whole grain depending on how they process the corn, but we're actually going to get onto flour in a second. So minimize foods made outside the home.
Miles, also crock pots and low work great through the day.
Yep, yeah, there's all kinds of techniques.
Very cheap meat or whatever, put on low and
Yep.
whole chicken in there for 6 hours.
Yep.
We'll take a quick break for people who have to leave, and then we'll wrap it up to announce the winner of the recipe contest. They were deliberating in French. Sweet potato black bean chili. Is that Elizabeth? Wow. All right, that is the first place winner. Come on down, Elizabeth. The judges said it looked and felt and tasted like it was really difficult to make. So because of the complexity and because they couldn't stop eating it. Thank you. Second place with tasty tostadas, Leslie Damron. Come on down. Oh, I'll hand it to you. And it was really, really hard because they said the salmon cakes were really good. But third place, Jessica Ruman, salmon cakes. Okay. Thank you.
Minimize sweets. I'm assuming that doesn't need a whole lot of description. Doesn't matter whether artificially flavored. Well, it probably does, or even worse. If you're going to eat a sweet, have something that your body recognizes, like sugar. If you're going to have something at home, try to use honey and maple syrup when you can. But overall, get rid of the sweet tooth. The connection between concentrated carbohydrates and bad health outcomes, including cancer, is pretty consistent. It's not super strong, but it's consistent. And for the same reason, minimize foods made with flour, especially for people who need to lose weight. Foods made with flour act pretty much like sugar in your body. So if I give you a slice of whole wheat bread, commercially made, so, Dave's or something, or I give you that much just plain old sugar, your blood sugar will rise about the same amount. So there's not a really, remember that foods made with flour, if you've got a blood sugar problem, if you're pre-diabetic, if you've got a weight problem, really minimize them. And when you minimize these, you're going to have a lot more room for true whole grains, beans, legumes, fruits, vegetables that will have the most anti-cancer impact. We're going to move on.
How about the rice and wine?
What was that?
Rice. And
Rice?
Wine. Should,
So brown.
why not about that? I read a ton of articles. They always, to me, they lie. They always say you should take the wine. It's good for you. And I read a ton of articles saying no. Anything related alcohol is a bad thing for you.
Well, we'll talk about alcohol in a little bit.
Okay.
I'm pro-alcohol, I hate to tell you. And did you say about rice?
Rice.
Yeah, so brown rice is a great food, as far as we can tell. So white rice, not so much. Because it's white rice we unkindly call congealed glucose. In fact, you can see a strong, white rice is one of those foods you can actually show a relationship between the amount of white rice people eat and the risk that they have of getting diabetes. It's kind of interesting. So we would argue that exercise, independent of diet, is also associated with somewhere in the region of 20 to 40% less risk of dying, as well as less side effects, fatigue, cardiotoxicity. A lot of our conventional therapies, especially radiation that involves the chest wall, a lot of our chemotherapies have pretty cardiotoxic effects. That can have long-term effects. And so once again, if you exercise, you can have less of these side effects, better mental outlook. You're going to recover better from cancer because the more muscle mass you can keep on, the better you bounce back. The less side effects you get, the less infections you get, and so on. And so this whole idea of I'm going to my cancer therapy and I'm going to come out a victor is sort of the approach you want to take. And if I'm going to be a victor, what do I have to do? So we're saying you should find something that you can do every day, upper and lower body, as much variety as you can. The more variety, the more different muscles you're going to have in action, the less injuries you're going to get, the less likely you are to fall down. Get shorter breath. So if you're not getting shorter breath, we would submit you're not exercising. Don't kid yourself. Include some tolerable weights. So a lot of people, for example, they might just walk and that's all they do. Walking's great if you get shorter breath. But if that's all you do, we think that's making a big mistake. There's just a whole lot more to do with health and muscle mass and different distribution of muscles and risk of injury. So use tolerable weights. And if you need to, get help. In this case, they looked at the risk of the amount of exercise people were getting and their rate of cancers, and anywhere, let's call it a third to a half less cancers in people who exercised around about 150 minutes a week of moderate or 75 minutes of vigorous activity. And not just lower risk of cancer incidence, but a substantially lower risk of dying of cancer. And you can almost abolish type 2 diabetes with exercise alone. Dramatically reduce heart disease. In fact, there was a really interesting study where they took people who had chest pain when they exercised, and they were randomized to a group where either they got a stent for their blocked artery or they went home and had an exercise program at home, not even supervised. And this was published in Circulation, so a flagship journal of American Heart. And the group that exercised had just as good results or better results than the stent group with fewer complications. So don't underestimate the necessity for having an exercise program. This study suggested a lower risk of cancer recurrence as well. And so people often sort of push this off to the side burner, and you can't do that. Or I guess not side burner, back burner. That's the term, isn't it? Back burner. So, start tonight. Before you go to bed, do something active. It's some stairs, some jumping jacks, even if it's only 30 seconds or a minute. So typically in our practice, we start people on 1 minute 3 times a day of something vigorous. And if people will do 1 minute 3 times a day, we argue you're going to be a different person in 10 years from now than you would if you didn't do that. And that's 3 minutes a day. We don't mind if they increase. You're allowed to increase from that. But don't underestimate the value of exercise, upper and lower body, as much variety as you can. And if you can include a game, ping pong is the best studied, believe it or not, pickleball, tennis. If you include a game that involves strategy, socializing, and exercise at once, that seems to have the greatest impact on dementia for anybody who cares, who remembers what I've said. So typically, what we're trying to say is, don't get hung up. This slide is trying to say, don't get hung up on any one type of exercise. As much variety as you can, but do it. Don't underestimate it. Sort of like cooking. The greatest degree of improvement is in terms of risk of dying of any approach, where the risk reduction for death we're all going to die, right? But over the period of the study, the risk of dying is somewhere around 10 to 15 minutes a week, which is around 3 hours a week, which is pretty close to what the last study showed. This data are pretty consistent. And pick a disease process, and I can show you this kind of level of exercise has dramatic effects. Mental health, cancer, heart disease, stroke, Parkinson's disease. And in addition to exercising more than once a day, think about not sitting for more than an hour. There's a saying out there that sitting is the new smoking, and actually it's got a pretty good basis for it. So if you're in a job, especially that involves sitting a lot, get up every hour. You're going to have less of everything. Move as if your life and well-being depended on it. Many of our patients sort of believe what we say about exercise, but somehow they don't think they really have to do it. It's something you sort of think about, you talk about, and you join a gym. But somehow people think that by sending a check to a gym every month, that somehow does something. We're saying, don't even join a gym. If you can't find time to do something at home, you're probably not going to go to the gym either. If you can find something to do at home, why pay the money for a gym? I hope nobody here owns a gym, but we do use gyms for a variety of reasons. For example, if we can use physical therapists to teach people how to exercise safely, that's an enormous, because many people sort of don't know where to start. So use trainers, use physical therapists, use a fit friend, but don't not do it. I guess this says what I've already said, doesn't it? Find things you can do. Involve your upper and lower body. Get short of breath every time. I'm kind of repeating myself, aren't I? So we talked about different techniques you can use to get involved in exercise. You can see it. The reason I'm emphasizing these points is we talk to people every day about this who aren't doing it. And we might see them month after month or year after year, and they're still not exercising. And we've even exercised with them in our exam room, and they still don't do it. So we really have a hard time understanding how we can get through to people's brains to say, you've got to exercise. Avoid sitting for more than an hour. And if you're not doing it, you have an attitude problem. And you don't really realize how important this is. There was an interesting study done in France where they followed this group of women for 40 years. It's kind of a pretty unique study. Nobody's ever done a study like this. And the women that stayed fit, one of the things they studied in these women was they put them on a bicycle ergometer every 2 years to see how fit they were. So this isn't women saying what they did. This was measuring how fit they were. And at the end of the 40-year follow-up, which was published recently, the women that had stayed fit during that time had 1/10 of the risk of dementia. So exercise is a lousy tool. If you've got dementia, exercise is a poor tool for reversing the dementia, unfortunately. But it's a fabulous tool for preventing dementia, it would appear. So attitude, how to fix your attitude problem. Find somebody who needs exercise, who needs encouragement. So maybe you know somebody who's not exercising as well, and you can be the good Samaritan and lead them to an exercise program. Maybe you can find somebody who is exercising but needs company. You can be their company. And the other thing is, whenever you've got an attitude problem, finding somebody you can reach out and help. Life is a whole lot better when you're making life better for somebody else. So you're not the only one who's suffering in the world. And if you can reach out and help somebody else who's also suffering, you're going to make your own life a lot better. So it's kind of a selfish thing to do. And then maybe they want somebody to cook with them. You can show them how to eat chickpeas. So sometimes people find it a little hard to believe that exercise can do as much for reducing risk of dying. Food seems to be easier for people to understand, but you eat food, somehow some things come out of the food and attack the cancer, right? That seems to be something people find easy to imagine. They have a harder time imagining exercise has all these benefits, when the exercise benefits are as impactful as diet benefits for not just cancer, but heart disease and so on. And so these are just some of the mechanisms that we have, for which we have reasonable data. And so remember, think of the exercise as attacking your cancer, attacking your heart disease, attacking your depression, and realize that it's a very real metabolic effect. And one of the reasons we mention 3 times a day is that in terms of blood sugar metabolism, which is closely tied to cancer outcomes, 3 times a day works better than once a day. So the way they've done these studies, they have people exercise for like 45 minutes a day once, or 15 minutes 3 times a day. And the 15 minutes 3 times a day group do better than the 45 minutes once a day. And if you look at historical precedent, humans up until the 50s or 60s didn't need exercise programs, right? Life involved activity. And so one of the interesting things is, historically, if you use historical precedent, which we think should be one of our priorities, historically, people who were active all day. If you're a woman kneading bread, hauling water, feeding the fire, chopping wood, throwing something at the dog, I don't know. I'm starting to make stuff up, but you get the idea. Life involved a lot of activity. And so so these are all different mechanisms that have a plausibility for why exercise attacks cancer. And this goes back to the idea that more people die of non-cancer, more cancer patients die of non-cancer causes than die of their cancer. And so that's another reason to think about the exercise aspect, is that not only will you feel better and have fewer side effects and pop back to normal life faster if you maintain exercise, but you'll also be less likely to fall prey to diabetes or heart disease following your cancer. There's a lady at the Fred Hutch, it's in Seattle, is a big cancer research group, and there's a lady there called Ann McTiernan, and she's written a lot about the issues of cancer and the cancer exercise for the cancer survivor. And she still can't believe that for the last 30 years when we've had this data, that we don't have exercise equipment in every cancer treatment room. And I agree with her. It's just, to me, it's immoral. These things are as important as anything else that we recommend. So I guess I've made this point. Maybe I haven't. Maybe there's one thing I haven't said about exercise, and that's that tiny little doses add up. If you're not exercising, start now, start tonight. If you're doing something for 15 seconds every hour, that's not nutty. That's sensible.
Give an example of a daily vigorous habit, exercise habit that is short. Okay, that's one. Do another. Okay, and another. Jump rope.
We got it. Did we? So. How many more do you need, Mrs. Kiefer?
That's getting coordination up. That's good.
You didn't like my other ones? You don't think this is coordination? Imagine that you are somebody who skips rope for 15 seconds a day. And let's say you're 50 or 60 years old. And for the next 30 years, you skip rope for 15 seconds a day. Are you going to be a different 90-year-old?
Yeah.
Sure.
Because your balance is going to be better, your coordination is going to be better, your confidence is going to be better, blah, blah.
I've been looking for chair exercises, for, where you can't do it, on your own, like jumping jacks or something like that, but you could do, vigorous things with your legs and arms from a chair. And there's quite a lot of good
Oh,
things
yeah.
on YouTube.
Yeah.
That I follow.
I see a physical therapist in the audience.
Oh, no.
You're running out of ideas? Let us refer you to a physical therapist who can find something that will work with your whatever you're going through. But don't say what you can't do. Ask yourself what you can do. Don't say you don't have time. Say, I don't have time not to do this. And everybody has 1 minute 3 times a day. Nobody's got an excuse. I'm not going to buy it. Get your waistline under control. So in the interest of time, we didn't include slides on this, but excess abdominal fat is consistently associated with more cancers and worse cancer outcomes and less response to conventional cancer therapies. And there's a bunch of medical reasons why it actually, if you're heavy, it's actually harder to do good cancer therapy, radiation, chemotherapy, and so on. So the obese patients have reduced survival, higher risk for cancer recurrence. If you lose weight and gain muscle during cancer therapy, you appear to do a lot better. The data is a little sketchy. So people, often people who are losing weight during cancer therapy, who need to lose weight, are told, oh, you can't lose weight because losing weight is associated with worse health outcomes, so eat ice cream. And we argue that that's not sensible. That what the cancer patient needs to do is gain muscle mass or not lose muscle mass and lose fat mass. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. So exercise during cancer therapy is one of the tools you can use to maintain muscle mass and lose fat mass. And so if you need to get your waistline under control, start with a big 5, fruit or vegetables with every meal or snack. I may have mentioned that earlier. Don't reduce your protein foods. Protein foods fill you up better than anything else does. And so, for example, if people need a snack, if we say, try a hard-boiled egg. Easy to keep around, and almost always people who have a hard-boiled egg are going to be able to put off the corn chips. They still want the corn chips, but yeah. Do reduce your risk, your intake of highly refined foods. So sweets, foods made with flour, breads, pasta, pastries, crackers. Eat food you make at home. That alone is associated with weight loss. If we can reduce how much time how many meals people eat out, this actually has been studied, then you automatically lose typically around a couple of 100 calories a day. And the brief, have I mentioned exercise? And this overlaps with the whole issue of diabetes and prediabetes. So diabetes and prediabetes are strongly associated with more cancers and worse outcomes from cancer. They're also associated with just about every illness known to man, including osteoarthritis. So if you're somebody who has type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, this is a time to say, I'm not going to just deal with my cancer. I'm going to deal with my diabetes or prediabetes as well. And the tools that you've got are prudent diet, less waistline, more muscle mass, and physical activity. And people often say, well, mine's genetic. And I say, how often do you see somebody who's slim, active, and eats well and still has diabetes? It does occur when people have a lousy pancreas, but it's rare. And so first of all, get slim, active, and eat well, and then I might buy your argument. But either way, you'll be healthier, and you can probably stay off drugs. And so if you need to lose weight, we've got a weight loss guide. We've got the type 2 diabetes reversal outline on the greatmed.org website. And then, did I mention the book? Alcohol, this came up, and it comes up a lot. And so I hope I haven't overdone it, but alcohol is extremely controversial, and I hope everybody has a copy of the slides, because all this stuff is in the slides. And innocently, if you look at the slides and you have some data that says you think we're wrong about anything, we'd love to hear from you. We like it if you tell us that we're wrong. We especially like it if you tell us we're wrong and we're not. But if you tell us we're wrong and we find out we are, we obviously we all win. So part of the problem with the whole alcohol thing is, how do you count how much people are drinking? How reliable are those stories? And what do you measure? So the thing that we think you should measure above all in alcohol studies is total mortality. Do people live or die? And so we use population studies and meta-analysis. So there's a bunch of outcomes studies out there. The Gates Foundation one that they use for the WHO guidelines that says you shouldn't drink any alcohol at all. We actually don't know what the methodology of that study is. So use studies where we know what the methodology is that deals with real populations in real time. And overall, I'm going to show some specific studies. Overall, the data are all over the place. And that's the important thing. So I can prove anything you want about alcohol if you just let me just pick my study, right? So you have to sort of look at the overall, the whole range of studies. Because you can see everything from a small protective effect to a small increase in risk with low to moderate intake. So remember, we're not talking about being an alcoholic, right? So anybody who shows you a study that says, wow, if you're drinking 60 grams of alcohol a day or more, you're going to have higher risk of cancer, I'd say, yeah, you're going to have higher risk of death from any number of causes, including car accidents, because that's 6 drinks a day. So when we're talking like 1 drink a day for women, 2 drinks a day for men max. And that has to be in your mind whenever you're interpreting what anybody tells you about alcohol. But so we have this fairly consistent data with any of these groups that this group has a lower risk of total mortality, regardless of what else you say about that group. I don't know of any study that doesn't show that. And so if low to moderate risk is associated with less risk of dying of any cause, that's kind of a good thing. If it's associated with better quality of life, which is consistently shown, that's a good thing. It's got all kinds of mechanisms, and the microbiome is just one interesting aspect of it. The phenolics and the antioxidant effects of ethanol, the cholesterol effects of ethanol, these are all possible mechanisms of action. So whenever you're looking at the toxic effects of alcohol, which are very real, you should also look at the potential benefits of alcohol. And remember, no matter who's talking about alcohol, we can all agree that heavy drinking is bad. And because this is so cloudy in the literature, so often you'll see an article that talks about the toxic effects of alcohol, and you see, well, they're referring to people who have 5, 10 drinks a day. Well, that's not what we're talking about. If people ate only broccoli every day, they'd probably do badly too. That doesn't mean broccoli is bad for you. So studies of low to moderate alcohol in patients with cancer appear to be reassuring. So low to moderate intake is appeared to be associated with lower overall mortality, better quality of life in multiple studies, without causing cancer-related harm, such as cancer-related death or cancer recurrence. But the data are really inconsistent. So once again, you can find any results you want. And so my conclusion is, the up to 7 drinks a day for women, maybe up to 10 for men, is reasonable. And we're going to look at a couple of breast cancer studies. So this is a study looking at 1,400 Japanese breast cancer patients followed for 8 years. And both all-cause and breast cancer-specific mortality was reduced in the drinkers compared to those who had never drank. And this is probably the biggest study that we know of, published quite a while ago, but it's still, I think, the best that we've got. And so 23,000 women followed for 11 years, so big group, invasive cancer, followed for a long time. And the people that drank moderate alcohol before diagnosis had better breast cancer specific survival. The women who had breast cancer and drank while they had breast cancer, it didn't seem to change their breast cancer outcomes at all. It didn't make them better or worse. but was associated with improved cardiovascular and overall survival. In other words, they were less likely to have a heart attack. So breast cancer specific results were unchanged, but heart attacks were reduced quite a bit. So total mortality was lower. And 36% lower all-cause mortality isn't shabby. Compare that to what we see with chemotherapy and radiation, and it helps you put it in context. And this article also had a fabulous review article associated with it that sort of talked about the whole subject in a way that I think is better than anything else I've seen. So even though it was 10 years ago, this is actually a really good pair of articles if you're interested in the subject. So I don't know if that helps you, sir. I know you're pretty anti-alcohol. But it's worth reading these and see what you think.
What kind of alcohol are you talking about?
Red wine still has the best data. So if you're going to bet your life on something, better on red wine. Actually, can I just finish? I just thought of something else. So a recent paper that we don't have here looked at something that they call a Mediterranean alcohol drinking pattern. Because there's so much slop in the literature, so much disagreement, so much contradiction in the literature on alcohol. They're trying to make some sense out of it because all of the Mediterranean diet studies that I think, epidemiologically, that showed benefit included alcohol as part of the benefit. And so the question is there some kind of synergism between alcohol and the rest of the diet in some healthy way? And so what they did is they looked at this pattern that they call a Mediterranean diet pattern, which was drinking with meals, mostly red wine, not very much spirits, not too much, and drinking with other people. These are all good rules for sensible drinking anyway. If you're drinking alone, watch out. So, and they found the lowest risk of death in this group was people who ate a Mediterranean-style diet and adopted a Mediterranean drinking pattern. And it was kind of interesting because it fits with also with what we see in the real world. So, but red wine was emphasized in this study. There was a question here?
I don't know if this is appropriate. I've treated for 3 cancers now for 18 years. I have my oncologist saying, yes, you can have alcohol occasionally, and pharmacists saying, absolutely not. So when...
Ask them for data.
Consistent, what's...
Ask them for data. And look at my papers. And if you want more papers, I can get you more. But Shelley and I were just talking about just how complex this data is because it's so sloppy. How much does somebody drink? What do they drink? How often do they drink? Do they binge? And that's where this Mediterranean pattern actually started making a whole lot of sense. It's the only paper I've ever seen that looked at this issue. And one of the other things that's interesting is the quality of life scores. So pretty much all of the studies agree that there's higher quality of life in the people who drink. So one of the things that you're faced with going through cancer is people are going to be giving you opinions. Often that opinion is based on nothing more than some lecture they had 20 years ago in medical school. And I'm guilty of that too. We all sort of just develop ideas, and if we're not challenged, we aren't forced to think about these ideas. And so read the papers I presented and see what you think. And if you find a paper that you think should supersede these, then let us know. So this is a question that came up. We're going to go on to some of the questions and obviously keep asking questions, but this is a question we get a lot about the rates of cancer. And we're just not seeing this burst of increased cancer that people are talking about. There's this perception, and I've been looking at this for 30 years. I'm not exaggerating. And overall, if you look at the last 25, 30 years, cancer rates have gone down, both cancer-specific diagnoses and cancer outcomes, in other words, deaths by cancer. Not a whole lot, but 1% every year or two, so not shabby. And so we're just not seeing a pattern of increased cancers. And so this is related to young people. We didn't find data just looking at young people, but there's a lot of, there's this concept that cancer's exploding, and we're just not seeing it. We think that's just a perception, not a reality. Did I answer the question? How different is cancer prevention diet than a diet for diabetes? Well, this is one of the, I might have to whisper again, Mia. But all the protective effective diet, it doesn't actually matter what disease process you're talking about. If you come to my heart disease lecture, it sounds pretty much like what I talked about. Just the footnotes change. By and large, it looks like there's a healthy pattern that we're designed, of a diet that we're designed to fit into, and it applies to pretty much every process. So you don't see any real significant difference between what we'd recommend for cancer and heart disease. For certain cancers, for example, if you came to me with breast cancer, we'd be talking about flax seeds as well. Details that we'd be here till midnight if we talked about them all. So there are possible influences you can have for any given cancer, but by and large, if you treat your type 2 diabetes, you're treating your cancer.
You had a question on your previous slide. It said, what types of screenings do you recommend?
Oh.
Didn't touch that yet?
Oh, sorry. So your cancer screening decisions should be based on a couple of things. One is your personal history, your family history, your personal fears. Because if something's going to keep you awake at night staring at the ceiling wondering if you have colon cancer, then probably get a colonoscopy or Cologuard or something. At the same time, you should know about the weakness of our cancer screening, so you don't get too caught up with the industrial side of it. And there's a book, it's fairly old now, called Overdiagnosed, that actually goes through a lot of this stuff. And then there's a lot of uncertainty. So, for example, there's a prostate cancer screening handout I give my male patients. And it's funny because half of them, these are, let's say I'm only talking about physicians in my practice. Half of them read this thing and say, I don't want prostate cancer screening. The others say, I read that thing, I'm going to get prostate cancer screening. In other words, there's a lot in terms of your total value, your own values, and how you're going to, how you're making your own decisions that relates to cancer screening. So it's actually not as easy a question to answer as you'd think about. But you should, if you're a male, you should think about PSA for prostate cancer. For anybody over 45, 50, they should at least think about colonoscopy or Cologuard. Maybe not as often as necessarily is recommended, but something. Mammography, depending on your history. But if you're a smoker, you could think about the lung cancer screening. But most of my former smokers actually choose not to because they say, they're sort of phlegmatic about it. Maybe that's why they're smokers. So it's a really individual choice. It's not as straightforward as you'd think. But all of those are, I guess, the main ones we should think about. Hey, Chris, can you think of anything else I should be including? Skin cancer?
Well, since you mentioned breast cancer so much,
Uh-huh.
is there the efficacy or value of mammography versus ultrasound?
Good question.
I do not have the expertise to really answer that. We usually do mammography on everybody except the ones that don't want mammography, in which case we do ultrasound. One thing I'd recommend is don't do thermography. Thermography is widely sold around the Portland area. And if there's a reason why conventional medicine abandoned it a long time ago. Remember, you can charge for thermography. We'd be all over it like a rash if it was good. So I can't answer that question, I'm afraid.
I don't know what the thermography is that you mentioned.
Not a problem.
Yeah.
Not worth knowing about.
But what would it be if someone, I get it.
It looks at heat patterns in the breast and tries to relate that too.
OHSU is doing a study using a blood sample for multiple, what do you think about how that's going?
So since the 70s, there's been attempts to look at the cells in the blood to see if you've got cancer or not. And we've never been able to make it work, but we're still trying. So don't hold your breath. But if it works out, great. Yeah.
Providence also has like the gallery test too.
That's
Yeah.
that's closely related to what she's
Okay,
talking about. Yeah, this gallery. We don't recommend it in our practice, but
Okay.
time may show us to be wrong. A lot of things create and this is where reading the Overdiagnosed book is really worthwhile. You really don't want to do something that creates uncertainty in your life and increases stress in your life and doesn't actually help outcomes. And we see a lot of that. Because remember, all of the things all of us do earn somebody money. And so, it doesn't hurt to be a little bit cynical and say, how will this help me? and my wife had breast cancer. You know, we've been through it all, and so it's not as if we don't know that people get cancer and die, right? That's what we deal with every day. But we don't have all the answers we'd like to have. We talked about that. How to maintain positive energy and mood levels without caffeine supplementation. And that just sounds like the dumbest question. I apologize for saying that, but what is wrong with caffeine that would make you want to avoid it? Coffee and tea are associated with better health outcomes consistently across a huge range of disease processes, including type 2 diabetes. So we would argue, you know, who in the world has told you that caffeine is bad for you? Now, caffeine supplementation, I'm assuming you mean coffee or tea. I'm assuming you don't mean little pills, no dose. And so we would argue coffee and tea is good for you. This question is irrelevant. Sorry.
So I feel like I'm oversharing, but I've heard though that caffeine can disrupt your hormones. So I'm not saying none, but I'm just saying, like you're saying, what's the devil's advocate? And I'm saying, well, there is some impact, but maybe not moderate.
A harmful one?
Well, just that it disrupts your hormones. So,
and so
it's like disrupts one hormone and then it like disrupts everything down the line.
Yeah. Have you ever see a good paper on that, let me know.
Okay.
Because we think that caffeine is associated with better quality of life in multiple studies. That doesn't mean that everybody should drink caffeine. So, for example, if you're somebody who has a cup of coffee at 11 o'clock in the morning and you can't sleep that night, you're somebody who probably shouldn't drink caffeine. You know, we're all individuals. I'm mostly a tea drinker, but I'm happy to drink coffee too. The issue for any of these foods, if you're allergic to strawberries, you probably shouldn't eat strawberries. That doesn't mean strawberries are bad for you. So some people probably don't do well with gas. Some people get palpitations when they drink coffee. Is fish oil important for good health? Fish oil in the form of like fish is important for good health. Fish oil in the form of an isolated supplement has very few applications. We use cod liver oil as a source of vitamin D because vitamin D supplements don't seem to work. So we hope cod liver oil does. We use fish oil or cod liver oil for people with dry eye as a pharmaceutical to drink, not to put in your eye. You know, a couple of tablespoons of cod liver oil a week probably will work really well for dry eye for most people.
Somebody said how much?
Oh, probably 2 or 3 tablespoons a week of cod liver oil. Helps dry eye. So we very high dose of fish oil help people with very high triglycerides. And that can be, so there's a few patients that we use and a refined product called EPA. So there's a very, very limited role for fish oil. Any other questions about fish oil? It's kind of a big topic, I guess. And we don't really see a case for krill oil. You know, the data for fish oil is pretty bad. I'm not aware of any data for krill oil.
So the omega-3 like capsules, that's not doing you much good.
Mm-mm. But omega-3 in the form of tuna or a slab of salmon is great.
Yeah.
So omega-3 fats are really important for your health. And that can come in nuts and seeds and fish. But to use an isolated fish oil supplement, except in rare cases, is not appropriate in my opinion. That's a question about letrozole for specific therapeutic questions. Probably are not appropriate for this discussion because it's so related. It's so strongly related to your disease process and your side effects and so on. So I won't answer that one. How different is cancer? Oh, that's sort of the same question, isn't it? How different is cancer prevention than diet for diabetes? About the same. Dietary recommendations related to so this is so about maybe a quarter or a third of lung cancers are in people who've never smoked, and we wouldn't have any stronger basis for recommendations apart from what we've already said for cancer. Yes, so insulin resistance, diabetes or prediabetes, probably double your risk of cancer overall, maybe triple. It's pretty strong. And so doing something about that, but as I said earlier, the same things you do for type 2 diabetes and prediabetes are the same thing you do for cancer anyway. And there's very, very rare situations where your glucose blood test is very useful. It's useful to warn you that you might have a problem. So for example, you have a fasting glucose of 130 or 140, then you should probably do some more tests to find out if you have diabetes. But in general, using fasting glucose in this way is not terribly helpful, except as a broad test that you might get once a year. And if you've got diabetes and you're on certain drugs, then you need frequent blood glucose testing. But we wouldn't, in relation to intermittent fasting, we wouldn't take blood sugars at all. Any thoughts about that question?
I'm just curious what you think of intermittent fasting in general.
Intermittent fasting is a great tool for weight loss if you're somebody who needs to lose weight. I look at the data and I don't see any benefit outside of that, and I like my 3 meals a day. So I'm prejudiced based on what I prefer. My partner, who's taller, smarter, and younger than I am, he thinks intermittent fasting has really strong metabolic effects. And we're both reading the same data. So I think that's an uncertainty. How's that? Anybody here have strong opinions on intermittent fasting data? No? Okay, all right. So, then no. But anything that reduces your calorie intake is a good thing if you need to. Yeah, so if I'm intermittent fasting, I'm not going to check my fasting blood glucose it's not going to affect my interpretation thereof. Okay, well, thank you very much. And I don't know if any of you have ever listened to our podcast. We're trying this podcast, and we'd love negative feedback. So if you have half an hour to spare, listen to my podcast and then tell me what's wrong with it. It's better to hear about from, huh?
What's that third line mean?
It's a misprint, okay?
Okay.
So the book is Good Food, Great Medicine. I may have mentioned it earlier. Thank you very much. Any thoughts, Shelley? Okay. Yeah.